When my family talked about homes, they talked about square meters, balconies, guest rooms, storage space, second bathrooms, walk-in closets, and how many people could sleep comfortably without feeling poor. When they talked about my home, they never used the word apartment. They called it the box, the shoebox, the phase, the temporary stop, the mistake you make when you're not trying hard enough. 28 square meters. One narrow window that only caught real sunlight for about 40 minutes a day if the weather was kind. Kitchen so small that opening the refrigerator meant the bathroom door wouldn't open all the way. Couch that unfolded into a bed so narrow I learned how to sleep frozen in one position. A bathroom where steam swallowed the mirror before my reflection could form. They laughed at every detail like it was a stand-up routine. My aunt once called it a decorative prison. My cousin asked if I paid rent in installments of embarrassment. My parents never defended it. They never corrected it. They never said she worked for this. They just smiled in that uncomfortable way that meant silence was easier than loyalty. What none of them ever wanted to hear was how much that place cost me emotionally. When I first moved in, I had almost nothing. I didn't have a real table. I didn't have a wardrobe. I had 2 spoons, 1 pan, a borrowed chair, and a mattress on the floor. I slept in my jacket the first 3 nights because the heating barely worked and the floor felt like ice crawling up my spine. But every night, staring at that cracked ceiling, I repeated the same sentence to myself like a private oath. This is mine. No one chose it for me. No one approved it. No one paid for it. No one could threaten to take it back. That sentence mattered more than comfort ever had. I grew up in a family where my future was always discussed in rooms I wasn't invited into. My relatives talked about what I should become. My parents talked about what I should sacrifice. And I learned very early that my value rose when I was useful and vanished when I needed anything in return. I was the one expected to endure quietly, to adapt, to be strong, which in my family meant to be silent and convenient. And then suddenly, inside 4 narrow walls with thin insulation and cheap flooring, I had something revolutionary: privacy. My own door. My own silence. My own mistakes would finally be mine alone. If something broke, there was no backup. There was no uncle to call, no hidden emergency fund, no parent to rescue me. My name stood alone on every bill. That changes the way you exist in the world. People who grow up with safety nets don't understand what it does to your spine when you become the net. When you know that one wrong step doesn't lead to embarrassment but to homelessness. You stop choosing what you want. You choose what keeps you standing. You stop dreaming loudly. You calculate quietly. My family never saw that part. They saw only the size. They saw only the narrow window. They saw only the couch bed. They never asked how many hours I worked. They never asked how many meals I skipped to keep rent on time. They never asked how many interviews I failed before I stabilized. They only measured my worth in square meters and unspoken comparison. And I failed that measurement in their eyes every single time. I skipped holidays because travel cost money. I skipped doctors because rest cost hours. I skipped birthdays because celebration felt irresponsible when survival was still fragile. My savings grew slowly and vanished often. I knew exactly how many weeks I could survive if everything collapsed. That number lived behind my heartbeat and kept me disciplined. The moment my savings grew even slightly, I didn't celebrate. I recalculated danger. That's what independence really looks like when no one funds it for you. It's not pride. It's permanent alertness. And then the moment came when their world cracked. Not mine. Their stability didn't collapse in one dramatic explosion. Crumbled in layers, quietly at first, then all at once. My uncle lost his job first. And not from scandal. Not publicly. Restructuring, they said. They said it was temporary. They said his experience would guarantee something new quickly. Weeks passed. Months passed. Money grew tight. My aunt's boutique stopped making money quietly at first, then loudly. Suppliers raised prices. Customers disappeared. She worked late. She borrowed. She denied. Then their landlord sold the building. And suddenly, panic stepped into the room where denial had lived. They still didn't ask me. Not directly. They tested me. My aunt commented under a photo of my window. At least your place is in the city, convenient. My mother said casually on the phone. If things ever got bad for them, you'd help, right? I didn't answer either time. They weren't joking. They were planting ownership. And when they finally spoke directly, the decision had already been made without me. They'll stay with you first, my mother said as if she were informing me that the weather would change. First, I repeated, already feeling my stomach drop. Just until they stabilize, she added quickly. That word again. Stabilize. The word people use when they want to stay forever but don't want to say it. For free? I asked. There was a pause long enough for the truth to inhale. Then she said it in the tone that had erased my agency my entire life. They're family! And standing there in my narrow kitchen, listening to the refrigerator hum, I finally understood the deepest truth I had ever avoided. They never believed my tiny apartment belonged to me. They believed I was simply holding it open for them. They didn't arrive with hesitation. They arrived with certainty. 4 suitcases, 2 backpacks, a box of shoes, a plastic bag full of tangled phone chargers and papers they never organized. My aunt smiled like she was entering a hotel lobby. My uncle stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, already scanning the room like an inspector. My cousin dragged the last suitcase across my floor, the wheels grinding into the laminate like a declaration of ownership. And just like that, my 28 square meters stopped being a home and became a checkpoint. My aunt stood in the middle of the room, turned in a slow circle and said, "It's smaller than I imagined." My uncle snorted. "At least we won't get lost inside." They laughed. I didn't. The laughter didn't bounce off the walls. Stuck to them. I moved my chair so they could pass. 'Cause there was nowhere else to move anything. My aunt went straight to the kitchenette and opened cabinets without asking. "You really only have 2 mugs?" she said, surprised, as if I had hidden the others out of spite. My cousin kicked his shoes off directly onto my only rug. "Relax," he said when I looked at them. "It's just the floor." That first night, no one asked where they would sleep. They simply assumed. I gave my aunt and uncle the couch. They left their bags in front of my bed. My cousin took the only chair. I slept that night on the bare floor with a thin blanket under me and my jacket under my head, listening to their breathing, their whispers, their quiet laughter as if my entire life wasn't happening 6 feet away from them. In the morning, the complaints began immediately. Coffee was weak. The shower pressure was bad. The mattress was uncomfortable. The room was depressing. My aunt stood in the doorway of the bathroom and said, "You really live like this?" I nodded. "Yes." She shook her head with theatrical pity. "You shouldn't have to." I almost said, "Neither should you," but I swallowed it. Because I didn't yet understand how dangerous silence was going to become. They stayed out late that day. When they came back, they brought noise with them. The music from a phone. No regard for neighbors. Lights on everywhere. Shoes kicked off wherever gravity decided. My food disappeared. My last yogurt was gone. My bread was half-eaten. My cheap cheese sliced thick with no apology. When I said something, my aunt laughed. "You won't miss one," she said as if scarcity were my personality flaw, not my financial reality. By the end of the first week, my electricity usage doubled. The water bill spiked. Trash filled twice as fast. The air in the apartment changed. Smelled like foreign perfume and entitlement. My cousin began sleeping on my couch during the day. Nowhere to sit. Nowhere to rest. My uncle spent 40 minutes at a time in the bathroom, scrolling loudly, coughing, occupying even the smallest privacy like it was his right. My aunt reorganized my kitchenette without asking. She moved my plates. She shifted my food. She criticized my grocery choices openly. "Who buys generic toothpaste?" she said one evening. "People who buy rent with no safety net," I replied. She laughed as if I had told a joke. The second week, my mother stopped by unannounced. She stood at the door, looked inside at the chaos, and smiled with relief. "See," she said. "It worked out." I stared at her. "For who?" She didn't answer. When she left, my aunt immediately said, "Your mom says we might need more time." Time. That word people use when they want permanence without responsibility. The end of the month, the rent notification hit my phone. I paid it without a word. The same night, I checked my bank account and felt a heavy pressure behind my eyes. Savings down. Utilities up. Groceries doubled. My margin shrinking quietly. The second month arrived without discussion. I paid again. Electricity. Water. Internet. My uncle joked that my Wi-Fi speed was better than theirs ever had been. My aunt complained that the signal dropped in the bathroom. My cousin asked if I could upgrade the plan. That night, lying on the floor again, I finally understood what was happening. They didn't lose their home. They transferred dependence. And they chose me because I was small. 'Cause they thought small meant bendable. 'Cause they thought survival had trained me to accept invasion as generosity. And they were right about one thing. Survival had trained me. But it hadn't trained me to disappear forever. By the third week, they stopped pretending they were guests and started acting like shareholders in my life. My uncle began making comments about shared responsibility. My aunt started calculating out loud how much everything cost in the apartment without including herself in the equation. My cousin treated my fridge like a convenience store that never closed. And every single bill arrived with my name on it alone. Electricity higher than ever before. Water bill doubled. Internet upgrade they requested. Heating adjusted to their comfort. I watched my savings bleed in real time while they watched television on my couch and complained about commercials. The first direct money conversation came over dinner that I paid for. My aunt pushed her plate aside dramatically and said, "We really thought you'd be more supportive." I stayed quiet. My uncle leaned back in his chair like a man delivering terms. "You're the only stable one right now," he said calmly. That word again. Table. The same word my family always used when they wanted to shift weight onto my spine. "Stability means contribute more," my aunt added. "You live cheap anyway." I slowly set my fork down. "I don't live cheap," I said. "I live calculated." They exchanged looks like I had spoken a foreign language. My cousin scoffed. "Same thing." The next day, my uncle handed me a folded piece of paper like it was a gift. It was a list. Projected costs. Food upgrades. Utility increases. Transport needs. At the bottom in his handwriting, my contribution. I stared at the number and felt my body go cold. He had assigned me a monthly financial role in a household I never agreed to create. "This is not a discussion," he said lightly. "This is just how families survive rough periods." I looked up at him slowly. "No, iraplia." This is how families hide exploitation behind vocabulary. That was the first time hostility surfaced openly. My aunt slammed a cabinet door. My cousin laughed without humor. My uncle's jaw tightened. "You think you're better than us," he accused. "No," I said quietly. "I think I finally understand you." That night my mother called after one of them contacted her in anger. "They say you're being cruel," she said immediately. "They say you're humiliating them." I leaned against the wall by my window and watched the city flicker below. They humiliated this apartment for years, I replied. Now it's the only roof they have and they still want to control it. My mother sighed. You're holding money over their heads. No, I said. They're standing under my expenses and calling it love. Pressure escalated quickly after that. They began calling relatives. They began rewriting the story. They began telling everyone I was cold, changed, greedy, unrecognizable. My cousin posted vague messages about betrayal and loyalty. My aunt cried loudly on phone calls I wasn't supposed to hear. My uncle began counting receipts on the kitchen table as if I were an employee whose performance needed review. All of it was meant to do one thing: break my resistance without looking like force. And for a few days it almost worked. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating well. I stayed out late just to avoid the air in my own apartment. I felt the familiar guilt claw at my chest. The old lesson repeating itself. If everyone is suffering, maybe I am the problem. But then one night I closed my banking app and realized something quietly powerful. They weren't draining me because they were desperate. They were draining me because they believed I would tolerate it. And that belief had always been their most dangerous habit. The breaking point didn't arrive with screaming or slammed doors. It arrived disguised as organization. One evening I came home later than usual, exhausted from a double shift, my shoulders aching, my head buzzing from too much noise and not enough rest. When I stepped inside my apartment, the air felt wrong. Too quiet. Too staged. My aunt had cleaned everything. Table was wiped. The floor was swept. The shoes were lined up neatly by the wall like a display. And right in the middle of my tiny dining table, placed with deliberate care, was a stack of papers. My uncle sat in the chair like he'd been waiting for a meeting to start. My cousin leaned against the wall, scrolling on his phone. My aunt stood near the kitchenette with her arms crossed. We thought it was time to be realistic, my uncle said calmly. I dropped my bag slowly onto the floor. About what? I asked. About terms, he replied. He slid the papers toward me. 3 pages. Typed. Neatly formatted. At the top in bold letters, household agreement. My hands didn't shake when I picked it up. That surprised me. The agreement outlined responsibilities. Meals. Utilities. Cleaning schedules. And then the section that made my stomach tighten. Financial contribution. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a structure. It listed exact amounts for food upgrades for their tastes, utility increases based on shared living, internet upgrade, maintenance, and at the bottom, the total monthly amount they expected me to cover as the primary stabilizing member. I looked up slowly. You wrote me a contract, I said. We formalized reality, my aunt replied. This way no one feels taken advantage of. The irony almost made me laugh. And your contribution? I asked. My uncle waved his hand dismissively. We contribute by being family, he said. A familiar heat rose in my chest. But this time it didn't burn blindly. Clarified. No, I said calmly. You contribute by paying. My uncle's smile vanished. My cousin finally looked up from his phone. You really are cold, he muttered. I flipped the page back and forth. You moved into my apartment without asking. You doubled my expenses. You reorganized my home. You assigned me a bill. Then you rewrote exploitation as structure, I said. That's not family. That's a takeover. My aunt scoffed. You sound dramatic. You sound entitled, I replied. The room went tight. My uncle stood up slowly. You forget who you're talking to. I met his gaze. You forget whose name is on the lease. Silence fell heavy and dense. If you don't sign, he said slowly, we'll have to reconsider staying here. I nodded once. Good. The word landed like a dropped plate. My aunt's eyes widened. You'd throw us out? She whispered. No, yen suwaret. I'd stop being occupied. That's when the tone changed entirely. My cousin cursed under his breath. My uncle's jaw tightened like a man realizing control had slipped a fraction too far. You'd really do this to us? My aunt asked, suddenly tearful. You'd put us on the street? I inhaled slowly. You arrived without asking. You stayed without planning. You demanded without shame. If the street happens, it's not something I'm giving to you. It's something you walk toward yourselves. Tears vanished instantly. My aunt straightened. You always were selfish, she said. My mother chose that moment to call. My phone vibrated on the table like an omen. My uncle answered it without asking me and put it on speaker. She's refusing, he said immediately. Refusing what? My mother demanded. To support us like family should, my aunt said loudly. She's treating us like tenants, my cousin added. I am treating you like adults, I said into the phone. For a moment, there was only breathing on the line. Then my mother spoke. How could you embarrass them like this? She asked. By showing them math? I replied. They mocked this apartment for years, I continued. Now they want to own it with my wallet. My mother's voice sharpened. You're being cruel for no reason. No, I said evenly. I'm being clear for the first reason. The argument escalated fast. Voices over voices. Accusations. Old resentments. New threats. My uncle already talking about calling other relatives. My aunt already crying dramatically. My cousin already recording parts of the conversation on his phone like evidence. And through all of it, something inside me finally stood fully upright. When the noise paused for half a second, I said the sentence that had been sitting in my chest for weeks. You have 48 hours to leave. Silence exploded across the room. You can't do that, my uncle snapped. I legally can, I replied. I already checked. My aunt stared at me like she'd never seen my face before. You planned this, she whispered. No, I said. You forced this. They stormed out of the apartment that night in pieces. My uncle first. My cousin slamming the door behind him. My aunt last, standing in the doorway long enough to say, You'll regret this. I met her eyes. No, I said. I'll remember it. When the door closed and the sound of their footsteps faded down the stairs, my apartment felt larger than it ever had before. Not in square meters. In oxygen. The silence after they left didn't last even 12 hours. I woke up the next morning to my phone vibrating like it had a fever. Missed calls. Messages. Voice notes. Not from them directly. First. From everyone else. Aunt Mira first. She never visited me. She never called before. Now her message sat at the top of my screen. How could you do this to your own blood? They have nowhere to go. Uncle Radu followed. Your behavior is disgraceful. You let money rot your soul. Then cousins I hadn't spoken to in years. People who only knew my story through curated suffering sent to them in fragments. She abandoned family. She chose comfort over loyalty. She always thought she was better. The story was already rewritten and distributed before I brushed my teeth. By noon, my mother posted a long message online. Not naming me directly, but everyone knew. Spoke about sacrifice. About children who forget who fed them. About ingratitude being the sickness of modern times. People reacted with hearts and sad faces and comments like, "Stay strong, you did your best." I read it sitting on my couch bed with the window open and the sound of traffic below feeling louder than usual. They weren't trying to convince me. They were trying to erase me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't rush to explain. I didn't comment. I didn't defend. I didn't call anyone back. I went to work late that day. My hands trembled while turning on my computer. My chest felt hollow, like someone had scooped something important out and left air behind. My boss noticed immediately. "What happened?" she asked. I told her everything. Not theatrically. Not with anger. Just the truth laid out in a straight line. Her face hardened as the story went on. "They tried to invoice your life," she said flatly. That sentence stayed with me all day. But the real damage came at night. When I returned home, there were bags at my door. My aunt's perfume clung to the air inside them like a warning. Under the bags, taped to my door, was a note written in thick, angry strokes. "We'll never forget this." My neighbors had seen it. The hallway smelled like judgment. I carried the bags inside one by one. They were heavy. Not with belongings with meaning, but with things they'd decided were mine now. Broken kitchen devices, old clothes, mismatched shoes, a box of tangled wires, waste disguised as inheritance. They had given me their leftovers and called it memory. That night I finally cried. Not loud. Not dramatically. Just silent tears that soaked into my pillow until my face felt numb. I didn't cry because they left. Cried because I finally understood they were never really mine in the first place. The next day the messages shifted tone. Now they weren't angry. They were strategic. My uncle sent a legal-looking document claiming verbal tenancy. My aunt threatened a lawsuit for financial damages. My cousin claimed emotional trauma. My mother called and left a voice note that sounded rehearsed. "We can still fix this if you apologize." Not if they apologized. If I did. The word fix meant restore the old order. I didn't reply. That same evening, a stranger knocked on my door. A woman in her 40s. A neighbor from the floor below. We had exchanged nods before, but never names. "I just wanted to say," she began carefully, "your family was asking people in the building if you were always like this." My throat tightened. "Like what?" She hesitated. "Cold. Unstable. Selfish." I felt heat rush into my face. "And you?" I asked. She looked at me for a long second. "I told them you were the only one who ever carried their groceries without being asked. That nearly broke me after everything else." But the real hit arrived 3 days later. In the form of a public family gathering. Baptism. Birthday. A reason to stage unity. My absence was noted loudly. My mother told everyone I had chosen money over blood. That I had thrown my aunt and uncle onto the street. That I had changed since city life. The version of me they painted wore all my worst fears as costume. And people believed it. 'Cause stories prefer villains that are quiet. I stopped being invited anywhere. Not directly. Not formally. I simply evaporated from plans. From group chats. From future conversations. My cousins didn't call anymore. My uncle blocked me. My aunt left one last voice note crying that she had raised me like a daughter and I had repaid her with exile. That was when it truly hit me. They didn't want resolution. They wanted obedience. They weren't hurt because I set boundaries. They were wounded because I removed their right to use me. And suddenly everything flipped. My apartment was quieter than ever. No voices. No demands. No waiting for the bathroom. No missing food. My expenses stabilized. My nights grew still. But the emotional noise followed me everywhere. In grocery stores. In work meetings. In the dark before sleep. The old instinct kept whispering, "If you surrender now, the pain stops." But the new voice answered, "If you surrender now, it never ends." And for the first time in my life, I chose the second voice to keep. The fall didn't happen all at once. Came in layers, just like their denial had. At first, they said they were managing. My mother told relatives they were staying with friends temporarily. My aunt posted photos of coffee cups in cafes pretending everything was normal. My uncle shared motivational quotes about resilience. My cousin uploaded party clips from borrowed couches. But reality doesn't respond to optimism or performance. Friendships grew thin after a week. 2 weeks. After a month, favors turned into discomfort. Discomfort turned into silence. And silence turned into doors that didn't open when they knocked. The first sign I heard wasn't even from them. It was from my neighbor Miriam. She caught me in the stairwell one evening and said carefully, "I saw your aunt yesterday near the station." She looked lost. I said nothing. The second sign came from my boss at work. She pulled me aside and said, "Someone matching your uncle's description came asking if we were hiring." Her voice was neutral, but her eyes were guarded. "He didn't look well," she added. That night my phone rang. A known number. I stared at it until it stopped. 2 minutes later it rang again. I answered without speaking. "It's me," my uncle said quietly. His voice sounded older, thinner. "We need to talk." I leaned against the wall by my window and watched the city lights blink. "You already did," I replied. "No," he said. "Not like this." I waited. He inhaled slowly. "We're running out of options." The sentence landed heavy. Options for what? I asked even though I already knew. "For staying afloat," he said. "For sleeping indoors," my aunt's voice added suddenly from the background. That was the first honest thing I'd heard from either of them in years. The silence stretched. "What do you want?" I asked finally. My aunt spoke first. "Just a little time," she said quickly. "A place to regroup." Everything went wrong so fast. I closed my eyes. "Everything went wrong the day you decided my life was your safety net," I replied. My cousin took the phone. "You don't have to be like this," he said. "You won. You made your point." "No," I said. "You lost access." "That's not a game." My uncle's voice came back quieter. "We can't afford a place. We can't afford deposits. We can't afford anything right now." "I know," I replied. "That's what rock bottom sounds like." My aunt began to cry openly on the line. I felt the old reflex flare. The urge to rescue, to patch, to carry. But underneath it, something new held firm. "We'll pay you back," she sobbed. "Eventually." The word eventually echoed with every promise they'd ever broken. "No," I said calmly. "There is no eventually left for you in my home." My uncle's breathing changed. He sounded angry now. "You'd really let us sleep in our car?" "No," I said. "You put yourselves there when you decided entitlement was negotiable." The line went dead after that. Not slammed. Hung up with something like disbelief. The next 2 weeks were quiet again. Too quiet. Then one evening as I returned from work, I saw them. Their car parked crooked near my building. My cousin sat in the driver's seat staring at nothing. My aunt leaned against the passenger door smoking nervously. My uncle stood on the sidewalk like someone waiting for a verdict. They didn't come to the intercom. They didn't ring my bell. They just waited for me to appear. When they saw me, my aunt rushed forward. "We just want to talk," she said. My uncle's eyes were rimmed red. My cousin looked thinner. I stopped 3 steps away, keeping the building between us like a line. "Talking already happened," I said quietly. "We need a chance," my cousin muttered. "You had months," I replied. My aunt dropped to her knees on the pavement. The sound was sharp and sudden. Passers-by paused. Some stared. Some whispered. "Please," she cried. "I was wrong. I should never have mocked your place. I should never have treated you like that." I felt everyone watching me. The stage they had created to force my compassion with shame. The old version of me would have folded right there. But survival had rewritten me. "Get up," I said evenly. She looked up hopeful. "Not for me," I added. "For your dignity." She stood trembling. My uncle stepped forward. "We didn't know it would end like this," he said. "You always land on your feet," I replied. "This time you wanted to land on mine." My cousin cursed under his breath. "So what now?" he snapped. "Now you figure it out," I said. "Like you told me to." Silence swallowed the sidewalk. No aplausos. No resolution. Just reality. And as I walked past them into my building, my legs shook harder than they ever had before. Not from fear, not from guilt, but from the final weight of choosing myself completely. They didn't attack me directly anymore. That phase had failed. Public tears had failed. Begging on the sidewalk had failed. Now they switched tactics. Silence on the surface. Poison underneath. I first noticed it at work. A colleague I barely spoke to suddenly asked carefully, "Can I ask you something personal?" I nodded. She hesitated. "Is it true your family is homeless because of you?" The words hit me harder than I expected. "That's not what happened," I replied quietly. She nodded, awkward. "That's just what I heard. Rumors don't announce themselves. They arrive already dressed as fact." At the grocery store, a distant cousin turned down another aisle when she saw me. The pharmacy, an old family friend, avoided my eyes. In online spaces, vague posts appeared about cold hearts, about betrayal disguised as independence, about how modern people forget their roots. My name was never used. But everyone knew who the shadow belonged to. They had learned that if they couldn't enter my home again, they could still enter how people saw me. And that hurts in a quieter, more corrosive way than shouting ever does. The worst part wasn't the lies. It was how believable they sounded when attached to my silence. My mother never contradicted them. Not once. She never defended me. She let the story drift where it would because it was easier than acknowledging where she stood. The messages stopped completely. No checking in. No asking if I was okay. No birthdays. No holidays. I became a ghost while still breathing. My apartment was peaceful. My mind was not. The old training returned late at night. The reflex to self-interrogate. Did I go too far? Could I have bent without breaking everything? Was I cruel? Was I proud? Was I wrong? Some nights I replayed my aunt kneeling on the pavement, tremor in her hands, the look in her eyes, and guilt would press against my ribs like a second heartbeat. But every time I reached the point where I almost broke and called them, another memory rose to stop me. Contract on my table. The list of my contribution. The way they laughed at my generic toothpaste. The way they treated my survival like a convenience. And the guilt twisted into something else. Not rage. Not satisfaction. Clarity. I started therapy after my boss insisted quietly. She didn't frame it as discipline. She framed it as armor. "You took a hit you didn't deserve," she said. "You don't heal that alone." In those sessions, I finally said out loud what I had never dared to admit. I was never loved for who I was. I was loved for how useful I could be. Silence followed that confession. Like an echo chamber finally emptied. The therapist asked a question that lodged in my chest like a stone. "If they never change, can you still live well?" I didn't answer immediately. The answer took weeks to form. And while I searched for it, they kept spreading their version of me. There were birthday parties I wasn't invited to. Group photos where I was missing on purpose. Comments under posts asking where I was answered with, "She chose her path." As if independence were exile. As if boundaries were betrayal. In the middle of all that, something strange began to happen. My world expanded while theirs tightened. I was promoted at work. The raise wasn't huge, but it was steady. I bought a Betrayal bed frame for the first time. I bought a small table that wasn't borrowed. I painted one wall of my apartment a deep, warm color just because I could. Every change felt quiet and radical. At night I slept better. No footsteps. No complaints. No silent judgment breathing from 6 feet away. The city outside my window started sounding like motion instead of threat. And yet, despite all of that, the shadow of their voices still found me in quiet moments. You abandoned us. You think you're better. You left us on the street. And then one evening, months after the sidewalk scene, a message arrived from an unknown account. It was a photo. My cousin standing beside a beat-up car. My uncle sitting on the curb. My aunt behind them with her head lowered. Under it, one sentence, "Look what you did." For a moment, the old storm surged back. Full force. Heart racing. Hands shaking. Breath shallow. That same old reflex to defend. To explain. To carry. But something new rose faster this time. A stillness. An understanding that their suffering, real as it was no longer mine to organize. I didn't reply. I deleted the message. I blocked the account. And then I cried, not from guilt this time, but from the strange, painful relief of finally choosing my own quiet over their chaos. The final attempt didn't come with anger. Came dressed as vulnerability. I was folding laundry on a quiet Sunday evening when my phone rang. Unknown number again. I stared at it for a long time before answering. "It's your mother," she said softly. And just like that, the ground inside my chest shifted. "Something happened," she added quickly. I didn't ask what. She never called unless something was already broken. "Your aunt collapsed," she continued. "Hospital. They're still running tests." The words were delivered carefully, like stepping stones across water. I closed my eyes. "Is she alive?" I asked. "Yes," my mother said. "But she's not well." There it was. The opening. The door they had been searching for months. I felt the old reflex surge up my spine. Go now. Fix this. Be useful again. But alongside it, another voice surfaced just as strong. Pause. Ask why. "Why are you calling me?" I asked quietly. There was a hesitation too long for coincidence. "Because you're family," she said. The same sentence they always used when they wanted to move weight back onto my shoulders. I leaned against the counter. "And what do you want me to do?" Another pause. "Maybe you could come to the hospital," she said. "She keeps asking for you." That almost worked. The image of my aunt's face pale, calling my name from a hospital bed, nearly cracked my resolve. But then memory pushed forward. Contract. The sidewalk. The message that said, "Look what you did." Performance of suffering. And I finally asked the question that had never been allowed before. "Did she ask for me, or did you decide I should come?" Silence flooded the line. My answer arrived inside that silence. "We just thought it might soften things," my mother finally said. I exhaled slowly. "So this is about reconciliation," I said, not asking. "It's about family," she insisted. "It's about control," I replied. Then came the next layer. My uncle took the phone. "She's scared," he said. "You wouldn't deny a sick woman comfort, would you?" The word deny was deliberate. Framed compassion as obligation. I felt my jaw tighten. "Is she dying?" I asked directly. "We don't know," he said. Then I answered just as directly. "When I was suffocating under your demands, no one came comfort me. The hospital. The sidewalk. In the messages. So no. I will not perform comfort now to make you feel cleansed." My mother gasped sharply. My uncle's voice dropped. "You're heartless," he said quietly. "No," I said. "I'm finally heart-boundaried." The word confused him. He didn't respond with logic. He responded with attack. "We should have never helped you with anything when you were younger," he snapped. "You've always been ungrateful." My chest tightened. "You never helped me when it counted," I replied. And then the line went dead. They didn't give up. They escalated. The next day, distant relatives called. Some cautious. Some aggressive. Some crying. Some accusing. "She might not make it," one whispered. "You'll regret this forever," another warned. "Is this how you repay blood?" A third demanded. They spread urgency like fire. They wrapped manipulation in panic. And this time I did something I'd never done in my life. I told the truth. Out loud. To everyone who called, I said the same sentence. I was used, mocked, drained, threatened, and publicly shamed. When I said no, they called it cruelty. I will not enter that cycle again, even if illness wears the mask. By the third repetition, my voice stopped shaking. By the 10th, my hands stopped trembling. By the 20th, the accusations stopped coming. And something else happened. The story they had controlled for months fractured. Some people went silent. Some apologized quietly. Some began asking questions they had never asked before. The hospital drama peaked fast. My aunt was stable. She was frightened. But she was not dying. The emergency softened into recovery. Crisis lost its leverage. And when the leverage vanished, they vanished again. Every attempt at reconciliation evaporated right along with it. I didn't go to the hospital. I didn't visit. I didn't send flowers. I didn't perform the public absolution they wanted. And for the first time, none of it destroyed me. That night, I sat on my couch bed with my lamp on low and realized something quietly monumental. They no longer held the emergency switch to my guilt. After the hospital story collapsed, something shifted in the background in a way I didn't expect. The noise around my name didn't stop instantly. Changed texture. Before, it had been anger and pity mixed into something sharp and loud. Now it became curiosity. People who had repeated their version without thinking suddenly went quiet. People who had avoided me before now lingered in conversations a little longer. Some asked careful questions. Some listened without interrupting. And when people finally listen instead of judge, stories lose their weapons. I was at work one afternoon when a woman from accounting, someone who had always kept a polite distance, sat down across from me in the break room and said softly, "I heard pieces of what happened, but not from them. From others. And it doesn't sound like what we were told." I didn't respond immediately. She continued, "Your aunt tried to borrow money from 3 people in this building. She told each one a different reason. She told none of them the full story. That was the first public crack in their narrative. After that, small confirmations stacked quietly. My landlord mentioned in passing that my uncle had come asking if the apartment was really under my name alone. A former neighbor of theirs ran into me downtown and whispered that they had moved between couches for months and burned every bridge with entitlement. Then one evening, my cousin's girlfriend, who had always seemed wary of their behavior, sent me a message. It was long. It was hesitant. And it ended with a sentence that finally drew the truth out of the shadows. "They said you threw them out for money, but they never told anyone about the contract they forced on you." For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. Truth didn't feel like victory. It felt like gravity finally returning to normal. People started asking different questions now. Not how could you abandon them, but why did they think they could do that to you? The shift didn't come with applause. It came with recalculation. And recalculation is what destroys false power. After that, the public shaming lost its fuel. My mother's vague posts stopped getting reactions. My aunt's emotional statuses fell flat. My uncle's motivational quotes landed in silence. They still didn't apologize. They simply lost the stage. And losing the stage frightened them more than losing me ever had. The next attempt came quietly. One envelope slipped under my door. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note in my mother's script. You've made your point. We've all suffered. We should start fresh. The word suffered hung in the air like a stain. Not we hurt you. Not we used you. But we suffered. I folded the note precisely and placed it in a drawer without response. That was my answer. Then came the final confrontation, not in person but in accidental proximity. I stood at a pedestrian crossing downtown one rainy evening when a familiar figure appeared at the opposite curb. My uncle. He was thinner now. Stooped. He didn't look powerful. He looked tired. Our eyes met across the street for a few seconds that felt like an entire argument compressed into silence. When the light turned green, we walked past each other. He slowed. I didn't. He said my name once. Hesitant. Like a test. I didn't turn. And in that moment, something inside me detached permanently. Not violently. Not angrily. Cleanly. Like a knot finally loosened after years of strain. That night, I returned to my apartment and stood still in the center of the room. The same 28 square meters. The same narrow window. The same modest furniture. But for the first time, nothing in the air belonged to them. No debt. No ambition. No claim. No émotionnel lien. My life no longer waited for their mood. I sat on my couch bed and realized I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Not because of pride. Not because of cruelty. But because returning to being owned would now feel like a betrayal of myself. And that was a betrayal I would never commit again. When the noise finally faded, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt empty in a way that was both terrifying and clean. For the first time in my life, there was no one to react to, no one to defend against, no one to prove wrong. The war ended not with a victory speech but with silence, and silence is where you finally hear yourself breathe again. The first weeks after the final cutoff felt unnatural. I kept waiting for another message, another accusation, another sudden crisis designed to pull me back into orbit. Nothing came. The absence itself became the message. They had moved on to other targets, other narratives, other sources of sympathy. And I was left alone with something I had never fully owned before, my own life without their shadow over it. I began with small things that seemed unimportant from the outside but felt massive on the inside. I rearranged my apartment. My bed moved closer to the window. My table faced the wall instead of the doorway. I replaced the rug they had ruined with something softer, warmer, chosen only because I liked it. I replaced dishes they had mocked with mismatched ones in colors they would have hated. There was power in that quiet rebellion. I stopped buying the cheapest version of everything. Not because I was suddenly rich, but because I was finally allowed to care about myself without hearing their voices in my head counting my choices. The therapy sessions shifted too. We no longer talked only about trauma. We talked about identity. Who are you when you're not being used? My therapist asked. That question broke open a space I had never explored. I didn't answer right away. Took weeks of walking home in the evenings, noticing city smells, overheard conversations, the rhythm of my own footsteps before something began to form. I realized I liked walking at night. I liked quiet cafes. I realized I liked reading slowly without distraction. I realized I liked not being needed in emergencies every other week. My worth no longer came from being the strongest person in the room. Came from being the calmest. I took a short solo trip for the first time in my life. Not far. Not expensive. Just 3 days by the water. I sat alone on a bench watching waves move without demanding anything from me. And in that stillness, I felt something I had never felt with my family around: permission to exist without justification. When I returned, my boss offered me a leadership role. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't loud. But it was steady. I accepted without panic for the first time. I wasn't scared to grow anymore because no one stood behind me waiting to extract a portion of it. My savings slowly stabilized. Not huge. Not dramatic. But consistent. And consistency felt like wealth compared to the chaos I had escaped. Some nights guilt still tried to knock quietly. But it no longer had a key. I could feel it, acknowledge it, and let it leave without answering. Once, while cleaning out a drawer, I found the note my mother had slipped under my door. "You've made your point. We've all suffered. We should start fresh." I read it again from a distance that finally showed its true shape. There was no apology in it. No responsibility. No acknowledgement of harm. Just a request for reset without repair. I folded it once more and placed it back where it belonged, in the past. And then, one evening, standing at my narrow window watching rain slide down the glass, I understood something with sudden clarity. They hadn't lost me because I was cruel. They had lost me because I stopped being available for harm. And sometimes that feels identical to abandonment to the people who benefit from your silence. I didn't feel angry anymore. Not even sad in the old way. I felt grounded. And grounding is what comes after survival when fear finally loosens its grip on your spine. The final confrontation did not come with shouting. Came with coincidence. And coincidence is always more dangerous because it doesn't give you time to prepare for who you have become. I was leaving a late meeting downtown when I saw my mother alone near the bus stop. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not fragile. Not broken. Just reduced. She was holding a thin grocery bag and staring at the street like she had forgotten where she was going. For a moment, I considered turning away. Not out of fear, not out of anger, but out of instinct to protect the quiet I had built. But she saw me first. Our eyes met. And in that second, I realized that there were no words left between us that could change anything. She stepped forward slowly. "You look different," she said. I nodded. "You do too." Silence stretched between us with the weight of everything unsaid. She nodded toward the buildings behind me. "They said you moved up," she added quietly. There was no accusation in her tone now. Just uncertainty. "I stayed," I said. "I just stopped folding." She lowered her eyes. She didn't ask about the apartment. She didn't ask about my money. She didn't ask about helping them. She asked something no one in my family had ever asked me before. "Are you okay?" Question felt foreign in her mouth. I took a breath. "I am," I said honestly. She pressed her lips together. A tear formed but did not fall. "They're having a hard time," she said quietly. I waited. She didn't continue. Because for the first time, she understood she had no leverage left. "I was hoping," she began, then stopped. "Hoping what?" I asked. "That maybe one day you'd come back," she said. "Not to the apartment. Not to support. Not to rescue." She meant back into the role. The invisible chair at the edge of every family gathering where I had sat my whole life. I felt something inside me soften, but not enough to bend. "I never left," I said. "I just stopped disappearing." She nodded slowly. Like someone finally hearing the language they had ignored for years. "They still talk about you," she said. "Of course they do," I replied. "People don't let go of what stopped serving them. They relabel it." She looked at me now with something like regret. "I didn't protect you," she whispered. That was the first true sentence she had given me in my entire life. And it almost undid me. But I stayed steady because truth doesn't require collapse. "No," I said gently. "You didn't." She inhaled sharply. "Is there any way?" "No," I said quietly. And this time the word wasn't a weapon. It was a boundary shaped like a door that closes without slamming. I don't hate any of you, I continued. But I will never live on the edge of your needs again. She nodded again. More tears now. But still no argument. No threats. No guilt. I just wanted to see your face, she said. Now you have, I replied. We stood there while traffic passed and people moved around us without knowing what was ending between two women who shared blood but no longer a life. When the bus arrived, she stepped toward it and paused. You were always stronger than we deserved, she said. I didn't answer. Not because I disagreed, but because strength was no longer the currency of my existence. She boarded without looking back. And I realized something quietly monumental. It wasn't closure that freed me. It was choosing not to reopen anything that taught me how to disappear. The real ending didn't come with applause. Came quietly the way real freedom always does. One ordinary morning I woke up without dread. No messages. No missed calls. No emergencies disguised as love. The city outside my narrow window moved the way it always had, indifferent and alive, and for the first time I moved with it instead of against it. I made coffee in my tiny kitchen and realized something strange. I no longer measured my life against theirs. I no longer wondered what they were saying about me. I no longer imagined their reactions to my choices. The invisible audience that had lived in my head my entire life had finally left the room. My 28 square meters were still small, but they were complete. Couch beds still folded out. The window still caught sunlight only for a short while. The bathroom still fogged instantly. But the space had changed because I had changed. It was no longer a waiting room for someone else's needs. It was no longer a fallback option for failures that were never mine. It was a finished sentence. I began to build a future without explaining it to anyone. I took a course I'd been postponing for years because it felt selfish. I started saying no without rehearsing guilt in advance. I learned how to rest without needing permission. Some evenings I would sit on the floor with my back against the wall and think about how close I had come to losing everything without realizing it. Not my apartment. Not my money. Not my reputation. But my right to exist without being useful. The strangest realization of all was this: they had taught me survival. But survival had taught me boundaries. And boundaries had taught me peace. I heard through quiet channels that things never really improved for them. Not catastrophically. Not neatly either. They drifted. Friends became distant. Relatives became careful. The sympathy they once lived on grew thinner when it no longer had a villain to feed on. And I understood then that I had never been the cause of their ruin. I had only been the cushion they wanted to fall on forever. 1 year after the sidewalk encounter, I stood in my apartment and measured the room again. Not in square meters, not in what others could fit inside, but in how much of myself it could finally hold. And for the first time in my life, the space was enough. Not because it was big, but because I was no longer small inside it. They used to mock my tiny apartment. They called it a box, a phase, a mistake. They believed my life was temporary until it became useful to them. They were wrong. My apartment was never the small thing in this story. My boundaries were. And once I built them, my life finally expanded. And that was the only revenge I ever needed.